As we last recounted, a singular act of violation shattered the final vestiges of monarchical rule in Rome, through the resolute efforts of men such as Brutus. The city turned its back on kings and set forth upon the path of the noble republic. With this new dawn came a new office, the highest in the land, the consul. And it was Brutus himself, as one of the first to hold this title, who laid down the articles of its power. The consuls were to be the supreme heads of the republic, elected by the Centuriate Assembly to wield chief executive and military authority. They could appoint subordinate officials. They could command the legions. One might reasonably ask, how did this new station differ from the kings of old? The distinction was crucial and rested upon two pillars. First, a consul's term was not for life, but for a single year, 1 year, after which the assembly would vote anew. Should the ballots not fall in your favor, you were to step down and return to the status of a private citizen. A most elegant fail-safe against ambition. Second, the office of consul was never held by one man, but by two. It was a dual command, and each possessed the absolute authority to nullify any command issued by the other. In other words, for any order to be executed, for any decree to be made law, the two consuls had to be in perfect accord. A two-factor authentication system for governance. Of course, such a system carried with it a rather glaring vulnerability. In the crucible of war, what if the two consuls disagreed? Imagine the scene. One demands a frontal assault, while the other insists upon a flanking maneuver to, as he might put it, kick the enemy's hindquarters. Such bickering, while the enemy advanced, would spell utter ruin. To prevent this very catastrophe, a supplemental provision was enacted, in circumstances of dire and universally acknowledged peril. The Roman Senate could appoint one of the consuls to the temporary office of dictator. This man would wield all power, absolute and without restraint. Critically, he could not be held accountable for his actions after the crisis had passed. To ensure his commands were obeyed without question, this dictator was assigned an escort of 24 lictors, each bearing a ceremonial axe. Should anyone dare to defy an order, a lictor would step forward and with a single brutal swing resolve the matter permanently. We must pause here to examine this rather grim instrument of persuasion. It was composed of a bundle of wooden rods, bound tightly together, with the blade of a gleaming axe protruding from its center. Its name at the time was the fasces. This Latin term was later appropriated, shall we say, to create a new English word, fascist. Yes, that very same word. Now burdened with the infamy of ages, originally signified nothing more than the headsman's axe of a Roman Republican dictator. It is for this reason that we so often link the words dictator and fascist today. They were, you see, born as the closest of companions. To view them then as we do now is to misunderstand their original context. In its time, this was seen as a sign of the Republic's advanced design, a necessary emergency protocol. And even today, one can find the fasces carved into monuments for Washington and Lincoln in the United States, and upon the national emblem of France. To declare it wholly evil is to ignore the long shadow of history. Beyond executive and military power, the consuls of this era held another vital prerogative. The appointment of senators, and the Senate of this new republic was no mere advisory council. Its powers had expanded dramatically. It now drafted and ratified legislation, and it approved the election of all high officials, from consuls and quaestors to praetors and the Pontifex Maximus himself. Without the Senate's assent, no law could pass, and no magistrate could take office. You might observe that this sounds remarkably similar to the powers of a certain legislative body in modern America. The Senate, you say? Indeed, the powers are alike, but one must always remember the direction of influence. America chose to emulate Rome. Rome did not travel through time to learn from America. Speaking of which, we must mention a man who stood shoulder to shoulder with Brutus in the Revolution, Publius. A notable figure in Roman history, he would later succeed Brutus as consul. But what grants him a peculiar resonance in our modern age is not his Roman career, but his adoption by three rather consequential Americans. To be specific, three of America's founding fathers, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, when they penned the collection of essays we now know as the Federalist Papers, the shared pseudonym they chose was Publius. The choice of name was a declaration of intent, a blueprint for the republic they sought to build. But let us return to Rome. We have established the supreme organs of the early republic: the Senate, the consuls, and the Centuriate Assembly. And yet, when we speak of Rome today, the Centuriate Assembly is rarely mentioned. Instead, we hear constant talk of the Roman People's Assembly. Why this change? The answer lies in a campaign of non-violent, non-cooperative resistance. The affair unfolded thus. In the year 494 BC, a mere 15 years after the founding of the Republic, Rome once again marched out to do battle. But this time, the Roman generals were confronted with a bewildering sight. The ranks behind them were shockingly thin. The well-equipped sons of the nobility were present, but the common soldiers, the plebeians who formed the bulk of the infantry, were simply gone. The reason was simple. The Roman plebs were on strike. They had taken their weapons, marched to a nearby hill, and encamped. The grievance of these farmer laborers was brutally practical. You consuls, you senators, and your Centuriate Assembly are all aristocrats and wealthy landowners. You hold all the land and all the power. We, the working men, have nothing. So why, precisely, are we the ones expected to bleed for Rome, even providing our own weapons to do so? History would remember this as the first secession of the plebs. The friction between the haves and the have-nots is an ancient and elemental force. It neither appears from nowhere nor vanishes on its own. After 2 centuries of monarchy, it was hardly surprising that tensions existed. What was surprising was how this crisis was resolved. The plebeians did not resort to violence, they simply withdrew their labor. And the patricians, after careful deliberation, did not resort to force. They chose to negotiate, and so it was that the plebeian assembly was born. This new body was composed entirely of commoners. Aristocrats were forbidden from participating. Most importantly, it established the office of the tribune of the plebs. As the name implies, their sole duty was to protect the common people. The tribune's most formidable power was the veto. With a single word, they could, in theory, strike down any decree from the Senate or the consuls that harmed the interests of the plebs, having secured the rights they demanded. The commoners descended from their hill, content, and rejoined the nobles to once more fight for Rome. In time, a third body, the tribal assembly, would splinter off. Representing local and regional interests, the Centuriate Assembly, the Plebeian Assembly, and the Tribal Assembly together constituted what we now call the Roman People's Assemblies. Each held powers of election, legislation, and justice, but their jurisdictions were distinct, creating a delicate system of checks and balances. There are, however, 2 crucial caveats. First, the tribune's veto was nullified during wartime, the moment Rome was officially at war, which, for the Roman Republic, was an almost permanent state of being. The tribune could no longer block the commands of the Senate and the consuls. The doors of the Temple of Janus, which stood open in times of war, were very rarely closed. Second was the matter of the patricians' evolving mindset. At first, they had accepted the tribunes through gritted teeth. But soon, they had a brilliant, if cynical, epiphany. Previously, they had to expend immense effort to sell their policies to the populace, but now, the people implicitly trusted the tribunes. The aristocrats' hearts soared. All they had to do was win over a handful of tribunes, and by extension, they had won over all of Rome. The task was infinitely simpler. The consequence was that many a tribune in Roman history was a protector of the people in name only. Many today know the Roman Republic and the empire that followed by another name, a grand motto, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome, SPQR. Its fame is so great that later figures, including the dictator Mussolini, were fond of styling themselves as Rome's heirs, stamping the letters SPQR on everything in sight. This has created the illusion that it was the official name of the Republic. The truth is a touch more complicated. Rome was simply Rome. The honorific SPQR was a latecomer, emerging only around 80 BC, in the final, sputtering decades of the Republic. It was not a formal name, but a powerful symbol, a brand identity for the Roman state. But let us return to Brutus, the consul. To lead legions into battle was both his duty and his glory. But in one fateful clash, that glory became final. During a battle against his own kin, he was struck down and killed by a spear thrown by his cousin. Why, you ask, would cousins be at war? The matter is not so complex. The monarchy had endured for 200 years. For one man, Brutus, to sweep it all away was an idea many powerful nobles could not stomach. Add to this the scheming of the exiled king, Tarquin the Proud, and it becomes clear that in the first decades of the Republic, civil war was perhaps more common than foreign war. This conflict tore families apart. Even Brutus's own two sons conspired to restore the monarchy. Their plot was discovered, and under the cold, unwavering gaze of their own father, both sons were sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out immediately. One must wonder, did the judge in this case not fear retribution for leaving the great consul without an heir? The truth is, he had no reason to fear, for the judge was Brutus himself. The law at this time was a nebulous thing known as customary law. Disputes were settled according to tradition. And in such a system, the word of the patriarch was absolute. A father could command his son's death, and it was so. By extension, the noble lords could arbitrate social disputes largely as they saw fit. But as the Republic matured, a cry arose from the common folk for clarity. They demanded that the laws be written down. A man should know what actions constituted a crime before he committed them. Finally, in 454 BC, the Senate relented. They dispatched a delegation to Greece to study their legal systems, with the intent of creating their own written or codified law. By 450 BC, Rome's first codified law was complete. It is known to history as the Law of the 12 Tables. The name was charmingly literal. The laws were inscribed upon 12 great bronze plaques. Today, the 12 Tables are often hailed as the wellspring of the civil law tradition. To understand why, one must look at the legal systems of the world today. Broadly, there are two. One is the common law system, born in England. The other is the civil law system, also called the continental, or more tellingly, the Roman law system. This tradition, which governs Japan, Russia, all of South America, and nearly all of continental Europe, traces its lineage directly back to Rome. Its concepts and terminology are Roman, and the source code, as it were, for all Roman law is the 12 Tables. From this perspective, to call those 12 bronze plates ancestor is no exaggeration, but we must not allow reverence to become blind worship by the values of our own time. Many of its articles were nothing short of monstrous. Table 4, on the rights of the father, stipulated that the head of the household had lifelong power over his family. He could monitor, beat, sell into servitude, or even kill his own kin, a decree more absolute than even the most rigid patriarchal codes known to history. Table 8 prescribed the death penalty for anyone who insulted another through song. A chilling thought. And so, through decades of adaptation, Rome transitioned from monarchy to republic. It established its institutions, quelled internal rebellion, pacified the common people, and codified its laws. A relative stability was achieved, of course. The struggle between plebeian and patrician never truly ended. The tactic of a mass walkout was employed several more times, each occasion ending in another compromise. And yet, their struggles were meaningful. They proved a timeless lesson. Power is not given, it is taken, and it must be taken intelligently. One must neither meekly accept scraps from under the table, nor, in a fit of pique, flip the table over entirely. The Roman people were clever, and the Roman nobility were not fools, because both sides understood the stakes. The table itself did not collapse. Instead, it grew larger and larger. But how does a nation's table grow larger? Does one simply knock on a neighbor's door and declare, "Greetings, I am Rome. Your kitchen now belongs to me"? No, the neighbor is certain to meet you at the door with a carving knife. Throughout history, there has been but one reliable method. In our modern age, the word invasion is rightly met with condemnation, and yet, if we are honest with our history, we find that the story of humanity is, in no small part, a history of invasion. Without it, the city-states of Mesopotamia would not have become great empires. Egypt and Persia would not have commanded such vast territories, and the flag of the British Empire would certainly not have been planted on every continent. One might point out that many of these invading empires are also objects of great historical praise. The confusion, I believe, lies in oversimplification. These empires were invaders, yes, but they were also builders, pioneers, and disseminators of culture. Their expansion was often bloody, but it was also often achieved through the sheer force of their influence. What we celebrate is not their conquest, but their contributions. Rome was such an empire. It was a creator of Western civilization and a pioneer of the rule of law. But it became a titan straddling 3 continents not by hosting dinner parties, but by invasion. After subjugating its neighbors, Rome turned its attention to the formidable Etruscans. After a brutal 10-year war, the great Etruscan city of Veii fell. Its people were sold into slavery, its lands annexed. The year was 396 BC. Historians today mark this as the starting point of Roman conquest. The victory was absolute, but the bill, when it came due, was ruinously high. Just 6 years later, with Rome's strength depleted, a new people from the north, the Gauls, swept down and sacked the city of Rome itself. The comeuppance was swift. Only after a plague broke out among their own ranks, a foe more formidable than any legion, did the Gauls accept a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold and depart. The Gauls had a technological edge, particularly with their cavalry, who rode upon a 4-horned saddle that offered superior stability. The Romans, ever the diligent students of their enemies, learned from this defeat. They copied the designs and rebuilt their strength. Once at full power, Rome forgot the pain of its humiliation and turned its gaze south, initiating the 3 great Samnite Wars. This conflict was even longer, spanning 50 years. In the final war, Roman manpower was so depleted that the Senate conscripted all males over 16, recalled veterans, and even armed freed slaves. In one desperate battle, the consul Decius Mus sacrificed himself, charging alone into the enemy ranks. The Roman soldiers, watching their commander engulfed by the enemy, seeing him cut down blade by blade, felt their blood turn to fire. They surged forward and routed a combined army of Samnites, Gauls and Etruscans, despite being heavily outnumbered. With the end of the Samnite Wars, the Roman Republic controlled most of the Italian peninsula. Every inch of it had been bought with blood. The only parts of Italy not under Roman dominion were the coastal city-states. These were Greek colonies, and their allegiance now lay with the Macedonian Empire. Rome, exhausted from constant warfare, had not yet bothered them, but what is inevitable will be. Once the interior was secure, Rome's gaze fell upon the coast. The first to feel its stare was the city of Tarentum. In 282 BC, a Roman army marched south. The people of Tarentum, terrified, sent a plea for help across the sea. Their cry was answered by a king named Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was a military genius, a man so skilled in war that he was nicknamed the Little Alexander. Seeing a chance for glory, he led his army to Italy. He brought with him 20 war elephants. The Romans had never seen such creatures. They were routed, They were defeated again in a second battle, but Pyrrhus, the victor, was not joyful. His own losses had been staggering. When a subordinate offered congratulations, the king famously replied, "One more such victory, and I shall have no one left to return with me." From this, the West derived a famous idiom, a Pyrrhic victory, a victory won at such ruinous cost that it is tantamount to defeat. Pyrrhus had come to Italy expecting an easy campaign, not a grinding war of attrition. He wanted out. A timely plea for help from the Greek city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily provided the perfect excuse. He abandoned Tarentum to its fate and sailed away. Tarentum, left to face Rome alone, promptly surrendered, and soon the entire Italian peninsula was united under Roman rule. Before we continue, we must turn our attention to Sicily and specifically to Carthage. If Syracuse was a grasshopper, then Carthage, looming on the coast of North Africa, was the bird of prey. The Carthaginians were Phoenicians. By this time, Carthage possessed the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. On the sea, they were untouchable. On land, they were less formidable, which is why they struggled against a general as gifted as Pyrrhus when he was in Sicily. But Pyrrhus, ever arrogant, managed to alienate his allies in Syracuse, who then joined forces with Carthage to drive him out. Before leaving Sicily, defeated, Pyrrhus is said to have looked back at the island and sighed, prophesying that he was leaving it as a wrestling ground for Rome and Carthage. He was, in this, a prophet. With Italy secured, Rome began to stare across the narrow strait at Sicily with a hungry look. Carthage, for its part, never ceased scheming to control the island. A clash was destined. All that was needed was a spark. In 264 BC, that spark was lit by a squalid dispute involving a band of rogue mercenaries. When the army of Syracuse marched to destroy them, the mercenary captain sent pleas for help to both Rome and Carthage. Carthage, seeing a golden opportunity, responded immediately. This Rome could not abide. The Roman Senate convened, the war horns were sounded, and the legions marched, a small plea for help from a small-minded bandit ignited a conflict between two titans that would last for 120 years. History calls it the Punic Wars. The name is simple enough to explain. The Romans called the people of Carthage Poni. Since Rome was the victor, the wars became known by the Roman name for the vanquished. The First Punic War began on the fields of Sicily, where the Roman legions won the initial engagements, but both sides knew that a war for an island would be won or lost upon the sea, and Rome, a civilization of farmers, had no navy. They were landlubbers, so they did what they did best. They learned, and they copied. They found a single beached Carthaginian warship and, in an astonishing feat of reverse engineering, they built a fleet. The ships were crude, but they included a novel and brutal innovation, a device they called the corvus. The crow. It was a great hinged gangplank with a heavy spike at its end. The Carthaginians, seeing this, nearly laughed themselves overboard. What was this absurd contraption? A clothesline, a flagpole for fools? They were about to find out. When a Roman ship pulled alongside, the corvus would drop with a great crash. Its spike, like a raptor's talon, would bite deep into the enemy deck, splintering timber and locking the two ships in a brutal, unbreakable embrace. In an instant, a sea battle became a land battle, and on land, the Roman legionary was king. Using this crude but effective technology, Rome shattered the naval supremacy of Carthage. The victory sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean. Emboldened, the Roman consul Regulus launched an invasion of Carthage's home territory in North Africa. Initially successful, his arrogance led him to a devastating defeat. Regulus himself was captured. A tale of stoic heroism arose around his captivity. The story goes that Carthage sent Regulus back to Rome to negotiate a peace treaty on the condition that he would return. Once in the Senate, however, Regulus passionately argued against peace. Then, true to his word, he returned to Carthage, where he was tortured and executed. A legend of Roman honor. Though perhaps more legend than fact, the war dragged on. Finally, in 241 BC, after a decisive Roman naval victory, an exhausted Carthage sued for peace. The First Punic War was over. Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily and pay a massive indemnity. The Roman victory was a testament to their national character. A relentless pride that refused anything less than total victory. Carthage, a state built on commerce and reliant on mercenaries, lacked that iron will. When the war became too costly, their merchant aristocrats decided it was better business to pay the fine and get back to making money, but their troubles were just beginning. Unable to pay their own mercenaries, Carthage was plunged into a bloody internal conflict known as the Mercenary War. While Carthage was distracted, Rome, in a move of pure cynical opportunism, seized the islands of Sardinia and Corsica. It was a blatant act of bullying, and Carthage was powerless to respond. It was in this atmosphere of humiliation that the great Carthaginian general, Hamilcar Barca, made a fateful decision. Blocked by Rome, he would lead an expedition west to conquer the territories of Spain and forge a new empire. As he prepared to depart, he brought his 9-year-old son to the temple, and there made the boy swear a sacred, terrible oath that for all his days he would live as an enemy of Rome. Having watched his son make this vow, Hamilcar took him on his campaign. This little boy, who learned to love war and hate Rome from his father's knee, would grow up to have a name that echoed through history, a name that would strike fear into the very heart of the Republic. His name was Hannibal. Hannibal followed his father, learning the art of war as they subdued tribe after tribe, first in North Africa, then across the strait in the Iberian Peninsula. After his father and brother-in-law were killed in battle, the 26-year-old Hannibal took command. His military genius was immediately apparent. Within 2 years, he had conquered all the lands south of the Ebro River, funneling immense wealth and manpower back to Carthage. This advance brought him to the banks of the Ebro. And there he paused, for the Ebro was more than water and rock. It was a line in the sand, a boundary established by treaty with Rome itself. To cross it meant war. A war his father had lost, a war that had cost his people dearly, but Hannibal was not his father, and in the temple, as a boy of 9, he had sworn an oath. Not an oath of peace, but of vengeance, and so the question he pondered on that riverbank as he gazed north was not one of strategy, or of politics, or of fear. It was a far simpler one. Why?